WebJobs is a feature of Azure App Service that enables you to run a program or a script in the same instance as that of a web app, a API app, or a mobile app. There is no additional cost to running WebJobs. Now, in this channel, I had previously shown you a video on how to get started with WebJobs and set up a build deploy pipeline using Azure DevOps. In that, I had just shown how to deploy a web job by itself. Since then, I have been getting a lot of questions around how to deploy a web app along with a web job into an Azure Web App instance. So in this video, we will look exactly that, how to go about setting up your build and deploy pipeline, whether to use one deploy pipeline or multiple deploy pipelines to deploy into the same web app. Let's explore some of these questions while we set up a web app and a web job to be deployed into a single web app instance. Hello everyone, my name is Rahul and welcome back to this YouTube channel. If you're new here, I make videos around .NET, Cloud and DevOps. So make sure to hit the subscribe button if you want to be notified every time a video comes out and also help me grow this channel. So without much delay, let's head off straight into code and start setting up the web app along with a web job application. Here, I have the repository of the web job example that I had used in my previous WebJobs video. Now, if you want to walk through the exact steps on setting up a new web job and the deploy pipeline, I highly recommend checking that other video. I will be using this repository as the baseline code to set up the example for our new web job along with the web app example. So I have copied this in my local machine into a different folder and named it web app with web job example. So let's open that in Visual Studio and start adding projects to this. As you can see, the project still remains the same, which is the webjob example.webjob. It has a functions.cs and a program.cs. It also takes in an app settings. To quickly recap the functionality of this web job, let's open up functions.cs. It listens to messages that's dropped inside a queue, which is using the queue trigger, and then it sends that using the queue client into a queue named processed. So all it does is listens to a message on one queue and drops that into another queue. It also appends that with the message processed before dropping it. Now let's set up this project with a React single page application so we can deploy that along with this web job. So we will have a web app and also a web job. To add a single page application, let's right click on the solution and choose add and select the new project option. Let's select the ASP.NET Core web application and click next. Let's name this as web app example and click create. This prompts to select the template for this particular web app. So let's select react.js, which is the React single page application template. Now I have talked about it in detail, how the template works and how to set that as a build deploy pipeline in a separate video as well. You can check that out if you are interested to understand the inner workings of this template. But for now, let's select this and click create. We have the new web app created. So if we build this and run, we can see the default template. To make sure it's working, so let's right click and set this up as a startup project and run this application. Now as expected, it automatically runs the npm install, which is baked into the csproj file in this React single page application template. The other video walks in detail on how this all works together. Once the npm install is done, it will launch the application by itself. The npm install and the build is successful and it has automatically launched this application. Here we have the default React single page application template launched automatically. So we have the home, the counter and the fetch data pages. So this hits a web API and gets back some data in here. So this is all default code that's provided by the template. Since we have got this working, let's commit all these changes and push it up into a new repository. Let's switch back to Azure DevOps and let's go to the repository and create a new repository under here. The existing code is under the repository WebJobs. So let's create a new repository and call this web app with WebJobs. Let's ignore adding a README and also not have any git ignore files. Let's click create. Now all these repositories are publicly available and the link will be there in the video below. So if you want to check out these repositories and associated pipelines, you can always use the link and go through it. Let's switch to the command line to make the git commit and push up into this repository. Now if you use the Visual Studio GUI or any other GUI tool to interact with Git, you can do that as well. So let's open up the terminal. Let's make sure we are in the correct folder and list the files that have changed. So let's do a git status and we can see the new project being added. So let's add in all the files. Now this has staged all the web app project that we have just added. Let's commit the changes to this repository. So let's say git commit -m and say added web app React SPA. That's single page application. Since I had copied over the repository, this already has the remote set up to the old path. So let's remove that. So let's say git remote, remove and specify origin. So that is going to remove that existing path it has. So if you check out -v again, those path is removed. Now let's make sure to add a new remote. So let's copy this and head back to the console and paste that inside here. So this sets up the remote and then pushes up all the code to it. We have successfully pushed up the changes. So let's go back to Azure DevOps and refresh this page and we have all the code that we have just committed in here. So let's start setting up the build deploy pipeline for this. This repository already has the Azure pipelines.yml, which is what I had used to set up the deploy pipeline for the web job. We will use this as a baseline to build the web app as well. Now, if you're not sure how I had set up this, make sure to watch the WEBJOBS video, which will be linked in the description before continuing. So now that we have all the changes in here, let's go to the pipelines. Under pipelines, let's create a new build pipeline. So let's click the new pipeline button here and select the appropriate repository. We have the code inside the Azure repos. So let's select that. Choose the appropriate repository. So in this case, it is web app with WEBJOBS. Since it already has a pipeline inside that with the name Azure pipelines.yml, it has automatically detected that file. To quickly recap, here we have a trigger on the master. It runs on the Windows VM. It uses a .NET Core CLI to set up a build, and then it publishes these projects into a specific directory. Note, for WEBJOBS, it's important that this project path is exactly the same. Now, depending on the trigger of the job, these folders also changes. But we'll need to make sure we keep this folder structure if it has to run as a web job. Once we have this published, we archive it and publish the artifacts, which will then be used in the release pipeline. Now let's modify this and add a few tasks to build the web app as well that belongs in this repository. Before we do that, let's answer one question on whether to have a single pipeline or multiple pipeline to do this. My personal preference is to keep the things that are released together in the same pipeline. So if the web app and the web job changes for the same reasons, then I would keep this in a single pipeline and deploy it into a single web app. Now if these are changing for different reasons, let's say the web app changes are not related to the web job at all, then I might keep this separate. But then in that cases, I would also deploy these into separate web app instances. Now this is particularly because I don't prefer installing selectively into folders inside an Azure web app. Now keeping it separate makes it easy and also deployment is also easier. Now with Azure, the pricing is at the app service plan. So you can have any number of web apps inside that particular plan. So you could still create a single app service plan which runs both the web jobs and web apps as separate applications. Now you need to pick and choose based on your needs and how your project is working. Now in this case, I will build and package them into a single folder so that we can deploy it inside one pipeline. If your need is to deploy them separately, watch my 2 separate videos on that. So let's get going and start building the web app project as well. Since this is already building out inside the build binaries directory, let's build and output the web app also into the same directory. Now for the web application, it needs to be at the root of the IIS. So if you look at here, we are packaging the publish output folder as the zip package that needs to be published. So let's publish out the web application also into that directory. Now the web job will already be there under the app data underscore jobs, continuous and YouTube web job on this particular step. So let's add a new task right below the publish web job and create a .NET Core CLI task again. So let's click Show Assistant, search for the .NET Core CLI task and then choose the publish task again. Since we are publishing a web app, let's leave this publish web projects ticked. Now as for arguments, let's copy this output directory up until the publish output folder. So let's copy that and pass that as an argument. So this will output all the published artifacts into this particular directory. Let's not zip this explicitly because we are doing that in a later step. Let's also not add the project's name, so let's untick that as well. Now the advanced shows the current working directory, which we can leave blank. So once this is done, make sure the cursor is in the appropriate position before you click add. So let's click add and that adds the task inside of here. Now earlier with the web job task, since there was only one project, I had used the star.cs project. So let's change this and make it more specific to select the appropriate project file. So let's click settings on the top of here to select that inside this assistant. And we can modify the project name. You can also do that inline in the text editor here. Let's go back to our project. Let's copy this project name, which is webjobexample.webjob in this particular case. Let's switch back to the pipeline file and paste this instead of the star here. Let's make sure to click add so that these changes are updated in this YML file as well. Now we have one step publishing the artifacts for the web job inside the publish output folder under the correct path for a web job, and we have another step which publishes the web app under the publish output folder as well. Then we archive this and create a publish artifact. That's all the changes that we need to combine both the web app and the web job into a single pipeline. So let's see if this is all working fine. So let's click save and run. Let's commit directly to the master branch in this case. Alternatively, you can create a new branch and also raise a pull request. Now if you are not familiar with the pull request workflow, you can check out my video linked here, which goes through the entire end-to-end process of creating and raising a pull request. For now, let's click save and run. This has triggered the build and it has started a new job. To get the details, we can click in here and see all the tasks on the left. This is currently waiting for an agent to be associated for the build to start. Once started, you can see all the tasks up on the left. So we have 3 .NET Core CLI tasks, one that builds, the other one that publishes the web job, and the one that we just added to publish the web app. It then archives and publishes the artifacts. Let's wait for this to complete to check on the artifact that is published. The build is successfully completed, and as you can see, we have published one artifact. Let's navigate back to the job summary and we can see one artifact that is published here. Let's click the one published and it shows up the default zip folder inside the drop folder. So let's download this to see how this file looks. So let's open this zip folder. As you can expect, we have the web app in the root folder with the app settings and the associated DLLs. We also have the client app, which is the React single page application. Now if we navigate back, it also has the app data folder, which has the jobs. Under the continuous folder, we have the YouTube web job. The first time you're setting up a pipeline, it's always good to download the zip file and make sure it has the files appropriately. So since this all looks good, let's navigate back and create a release pipeline for this project. In Azure DevOps, let's go to releases and start creating a new release for this particular pipeline. So we can create a new pipeline. So let's click new release pipeline. Make sure to select the Azure App Service because that's where we are going to deploy to. So we can use that template. So let's click apply. This asks for a stage. So let's say this is the development stage. So let's call this dev and close this. Before we forget, let's also give this a name. Let's name this web app with web job. To set up the release pipeline, we need to trigger this based on an artifact. So in this case, this will be the build triggered artifact. The build is one we had just set up. So let's select for that and search for the web app with WebJobs build. This already shows the latest build version, so let's click Add. Now this has associated this particular release pipeline with that build pipeline. If we want to automatically run this pipeline anytime a build is created, let's use this icon over here and make sure to select the continuous deployment trigger. So let's turn this on. We can also set up branch filters if that's required. Let's close this. Let's now set up the dev stage. So let's click on one job and the task and select the appropriate web app to deploy this into. Now I don't have any web application created, so we'll have to navigate into the Azure portal to do that. The other way to do this is to automatically use infrastructure as code. For example, we can use ARM templates to create automatically the resources that we need. I have another video which walks through this entire step and the whole ARM template creation process. Check that if you want to set this up automatically. For now, I will just use manual way and create the web app the first time I want to deploy into it. So let's navigate over to the Azure portal, go to resource groups and create a new resource group. So let's click create. Let's call this web app with WEBJOB-YouTube to keep this unique. Let's select a region. In this case, let's choose Australia because I am there. And let's click review and create. This will create a new resource group under my subscription. Let's navigate to this resource group and add an Azure Web App. So let's click Add and select the web app under here. You can also search for the service if you cannot find directly there. So this is now belonging to this resource group. So let's create the web app name. So let's say web app with WEBJOB-dev because this is the dev instance. This name needs to be unique inside the whole Azure because we are getting a domain that's associated with azurewebsites.net. So let's keep this code and select the runtime stack as .NET Core because that is what I have. Let's keep the region again as Australia. Let's create a new service plan in this case. So I have the free service plan created automatically. If you want to use a different size and plan, you can also click the create new and select the appropriate service plan. For now, let's keep it in the free tier and click review and create. Since this all looks good, let's click create to create the new Azure Web App. The resource is successfully created, so let's navigate to the newly created resource. So this is an Azure Web App, so let's start deploying into this. So navigating back to our Azure DevOps pipeline, we should be able to select the app service name. Now this is because I have my Azure DevOps connected to that Azure subscription. Now if you're not sure how to do that, you can use service connections and I walk you through that in another video which will be linked here and in the description below. Now since I have this set up, let's make sure to select the appropriate subscription. In this case, it's the Visual Studio Professional, and then let's choose the associated app service from that. This shows up the web app with WEBJOB-dev that we just created. So let's select that. Let's go into the task that deploys the Azure App Service. It has all the correct parameters set up. So this is a web app on Windows and it also has the correct app service name. Now let's choose the package or folder. Since this has a .zip folder that we just saw earlier, we can use that to deploy. The web job in our example, as we can see here, if we open up the webjob.example and open the app settings, depends on an Azure Web Storage connection string. Now we need to provide this as well for this web job to work fine. So let's navigate back to the Azure portal and create a new resource that is a storage under that particular resource group. So if we go back to the resource groups, let's select the appropriate resource group. Let's use the add button and select the storage account. So we can click create from here. You can also search for storage and select that if it doesn't appear in this first list. So let's click create. Let's make sure to place this in the correct resource group. In my case, it's the web app with WEBJOB-YouTube and give an appropriate storage account name. Let's name this web app with WEBJOB-dev. So this is the storage account for the development instance. Let's make sure to select the appropriate region. So let's search for Australia and select the Australia East. You can select the appropriate redundancy that's required for you. In my case, let's leave it to locally redundant storage and click review and create. This has successfully created the storage account. So let's go to the resource and copy in the connection string to this storage account. So I can go under access keys and copy this connection string in here. So let's say show keys and copy this from here. Let's navigate back to our Azure DevOps and we can set up this connection string inside variables. If you're new to variables, check out my video where I walk you through the entire process of variables and how it works. So let's click add and specify the value as the connection string that we just copied. For the name, let's navigate back to the source code and copy this Azure WebJob storage. And let's paste that in here. Since this is a secret, let's click the lock button and this will make it as non-readable forever. This is for the dev stage, so let's select the appropriate stage in here. Now navigating back to the tasks, we need to specify to this Azure App Service to replace the files using the variables from here. Now under the file transforms and variable substitution options, we can specify the web.config or the JSON file that we need to transform. In our case, the file that needs to be transformed is the app-settings.json. Since we had seen this file is under YouTube WebJob and app-settings.json, so let's copy this YouTube WebJob path, navigate back and specify ** which selects any directory, and then let's specify one more star which selects any subdirectories and say it is under the YouTube WebJob folder with the name app-settings.json. So let's select that as well. Once this is set up, this will be automatically replacing this particular file with variables that we have defined. It also picks up the variables based on the stage that this is running on. So let's click Save. So we have created a new release pipeline. So let's click Create a Release and click Create. So this has created a new release. Let's navigate to that to see how it progresses. This is currently queued for an agent. So if we select in here, we can see the details of the steps that's inside that. If we click the logs, we can see all the log statements and the associated tasks that's running as part of this release pipeline. In the steps, in the logs, we can see here that substituting value of key Azure WebJob storage, and this is successfully done. So make sure to check the logs to see if the variable transformations is happening correctly. Now this particular job is completed and it's all succeeded. So if we navigate back to the web app with the web job, we should now be able to run this application. So let's go back to the resource group and go to the web application that we have created. Now under the overview, we can navigate to this URL. So let's click on that, which navigates to that particular web app instance. We can see the React single page application template that we had set up as part of this project. Now if we navigate to counter and fetch data, we can see the appropriate data being showed up. Now let's navigate back and make sure the web job is also successfully installed. So under the menu here, let's scroll down and select the web jobs in here. This shows the web jobs that's running as part of this web application. Now in here we have the YouTube web job that's running as part of it. Let's select that and select the logs for that YouTube web job. Now let's navigate into the Azure portal, drop in a message manually into the queue, and then see if the web job is also working as expected. To do that, let's navigate back to the resource group. So let's go into Overview, select the resource group under here, go to the storage account and start creating a queue inside of this. So here we don't have any queues created. So under the queues, I can create 2 new queues. So if you remember from earlier in the functions.cs, we saw that it requires a processed queue and a queue with the name queue. So let's create these 2 first. So let's click the plus button here and create a new queue. Let's also create one for processed and click OK. So we have the 2 queues created. So let's go into the queue, which is where the web job is listening to, and drop a new message inside there. To do that, let's create an add message and specify hello from web job. And let's click OK. This drops the message inside here and the web job should automatically pick this up. So let's refresh this and it's already gone because the web job has processed this. If we navigate back into the queues and go into the processed, we can see that message dropped inside here, which says processed hello from web job, which is exactly what the web job is set up to do inside the functions.cs class. If we navigate back to the web jobs dashboard, we can see the status of the web job. Clicking the toggle output, we can see the logs from this particular web job. Here you can see that it has already picked up the message hello from web job. which is why it was all functioning as expected. Navigating back to the Azure DevOps, we have a successful release pipeline that is created for the web app with WebJob. Now in this particular case, we only have one stage that is created, which is the dev, but you can easily replicate this into other stages like test, production, etc. All you need to do is edit this particular template and create a new stage under this particular release pipeline. You can do that from here or also clone this existing one and start modifying the values for that. So let's say if we click clone, we can use this button to disassociate this with this particular task and select this is a manual trigger. In this case, what happens is you can deploy first into dev automatically and then manually promote it into your other environments, like once the first initial development testing is done. So you can name this as test or production depending on the pipeline that you follow. You can also modify the tasks under this to choose the appropriate web jobs. So in this case, it would be web app with webjob-test. When you do that, also make sure to update the variables, which is already showing a red icon here. So it will have its own storage account and the connection string needs to be updated here. I do cover these in the other videos that was linked for WebJobs and the React single page application template. So to keep this video short, let's just leave it with the dev stage. I will save and also link this pipeline inside the comments. So if you want to check and refer, feel free to do that. I hope this helps you to understand how to set up a build pipeline for a web app along with a web job. Now again, going back to the question of having multiple pipelines, like I said, I usually prefer to keep it separate if they are separate. So if they change for the different reasons, let's have different web apps and deploy them separately, rather than picking and modifying folders inside a specific web application. If you have any questions or feedback, feel free to drop in the comments below. If you like this video, please make sure to hit the like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe if you want to be notified of future similar videos. Thank you and see you soon.